One was a god of war, the military genius who had rewritten the rules of the battlefield and brought all of Europe to its knees for over a decade. The other was the stubborn master of defense, the aquiline-nosed aristocrat who patiently awaited him atop a mud-soaked ridge. On one side of the field, Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor freshly escaped from his exile on the island of Elba, commands an army of fanatical veterans, men who have marched with him to Moscow and back, ready to reconquer the world under the gaze of their imperial eagle. His presence on the field is a weapon in itself, a promise of glory and inevitable victory. On the other side, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, has staked the fate of all the nations of Europe on a single, desperate tactic: to hold. His army is an amalgam of nationalities, many of them inexperienced recruits, outnumbered and facing the greatest general the world had ever seen. He knows he cannot outmatch Napoleon in brilliant maneuvers or offensive audacity. His only hope lies in the discipline of his men, in the choice of ground, and in an almost blind faith that help will arrive before his line breaks. The ridge of Mont Saint-Jean is not just a piece of land, it is the last bulwark against tyranny. On June 18, 1815, in a small field in Belgium near a village called Waterloo, two eras, two philosophies of war, and the two most famous generals of their time will collide in a final, cataclysmic showdown. It is not just a battle for a kingdom or a border, it is a battle for the soul of Europe. The world holds its breath, for at the end of this day, only one of these giants will still be standing. The stage is set for the confrontation that will define a century, a storm of steel, mud, and blood that will end an age of warfare and forge the map of the modern world. Commanding the Anglo-Allied army was Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. He was the antithesis of Napoleon, calm, pragmatic, reserved, and deeply realistic. The Iron Duke harbored no illusions about his situation. He knew his army was inferior in experience and cohesion to his adversaries. He knew he was fighting a desperate defensive battle. His mood was not one of arrogant confidence, but of cold, calculating determination. His plan was simple and brutally honest: to choose the best possible defensive ground, use it to minimize Napoleon's advantages, and hold on long enough for his Prussian allies, led by Marshal Blucher, to arrive and tip the balance. Every minute counted. Wellington's army was an awkward, multicultural creature, a mosaic of 68,000 men. Fewer than half were British. The rest were Germans from the King's German Legion, Hanoverians, Dutch, and Belgians, some of whose loyalties were questionable. Many were raw recruits who had never seen a battle. However, the backbone of this force was the veteran British infantry, professional soldiers hardened by years of fighting in the Peninsular War. They were masters of defense, disciplined and lethal with their Brown Bess muskets. The motivation of this army was clear and existential: to stop the Napoleonic war machine once and for all, to end 23 years of conflict, and to restore peace and order to Europe. Facing them was the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte in person, brilliant as ever, but also desperate. He had escaped from exile and retaken power in France without firing a shot, but he knew his position was precarious. The Seventh Coalition of European nations was mobilizing to crush him. He needed a quick, decisive, and spectacular victory to solidify his rule in Paris and shatter the alliance before it could gather its full strength. Waterloo was not just a battle for him, it was his last chance. His mindset was that of a gambler betting everything on a single card, trusting in his genius and the fanatical devotion of his troops to achieve a miracle. Napoleon's Army of the North was a formidable war machine. Comprising 72,000 men, it was a homogeneous force, almost entirely French, made up of hardened veterans who had answered their emperor's call. They were experienced, loyal to the death, and blindly confident in their leader's invincibility. However, this force had a fatal weakness that lay in its commander's mind: arrogance. Napoleon held a deep tactical contempt for Wellington, whom he dismissively called the Sepoy General, for his service in India. He firmly believed that a massive bombardment from his superior artillery, followed by a frontal assault of infantry and cavalry, would be more than enough to sweep the British in scum from the ridge. Wellington, a master of defensive tactics, had chosen his battlefield with meticulous genius. The terrain at Waterloo was not spectacular, but it was perfect for his purposes. He selected a low ridge, that of Mont Saint-Jean, which stretched across the front. But his true stroke of genius was how he used it. Instead of placing his troops on the crest of the ridge, in full view of the enemy, he positioned them on the reverse slope, the side of the hill hidden from the French. This simple decision would shield the bulk of his army from the devastating fire of Napoleon's artillery, the weapon that had won so many of his battles. Furthermore, the field was dotted with 3 key fortified points: the farmhouse and chateau of Hougoumont on his right, the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in the center, and the hamlets of Papelotte and La Haye on his left. Wellington understood that these stone compounds would act as breakwaters, anchoring his line and disrupting the cohesion of the French attack waves. They would force Napoleon to divert thousands of his best troops to take them, bleeding his main force before it could even reach the British line. The terrain was not a mere stage. It was a weapon, a carefully laid trap. The battle for the fate of Europe is about to begin on this ridge. To see how Wellington's defense stands against Napoleon's genius, subscribe and activate notifications, because the Imperial Guard is about to march for the last time. The battle began late, around 11:30 in the morning, a delay caused by the mud which Napoleon believed would give the ground time to dry for his artillery. His initial plan was to launch a diversionary attack on Wellington's right flank at the chateau and farm of Hougoumont to draw in his reserves. Then, he would unleash a massive bombardment on the center and assault it with his infantry. However, what was meant to be a diversion turned into a savage, self-contained battle. The obstinate defense by the British and German guards at Hougoumont was legendary, repelling one assault after another. Throughout the day, Napoleon was forced to commit more and more elite troops to this secondary fight, a black hole that consumed thousands of his best men and frustrated his main plan. While Hougoumont burned, Napoleon prepared his real attack. At 1:30 p.m., his Grande Batterie of 80 cannons opened fire on Wellington's center left. The bombardment was terrifying, but largely ineffective. Most of the shells flew over the heads of the British infantry, who lay protected on the reverse slope. After the bombardment, Marshal d'Erlon advanced with an army corps of 16,000 men. They succeeded in pushing back the Dutch and Belgian troops, but just as they reached the crest of the ridge, Wellington sprang his trap. Picton's British infantry stood up and delivered a point-blank volley that shattered the head of the French columns. The fighting in the center descended into chaos. At the critical moment, Wellington's cavalry commander, Lord Uxbridge, launched his 2 heavy cavalry brigades, the Royal Scots Greys and the Household Brigade, against d'Erlon's infantry. The charge was devastating, shattering the French regiments and forcing them to flee in disarray. However, carried away by success, the British horsemen lost their discipline, charged too far, and were counterattacked and decimated by French cavalry. Wellington had repelled the first major assault, but at a terrible cost to his own cavalry. The battle was far from over. Around 3:30 p.m., one of the most famous blunders of the battle occurred. Marshal Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, observing the movement of wounded and prisoners to the British rear, mistook it for the beginning of a general retreat. Without consulting Napoleon, Ney gathered the entirety of the French reserve cavalry, nearly 10,000 horsemen, and launched one of the most massive cavalry charges in history against Wellington's center. It was a glorious and terrifying sight, a tide of cuirassiers and lancers galloping up the slope. Wellington responded calmly, ordering his infantry to form squares. Infantry squares were formations almost impenetrable to cavalry. They were hedgehogs of bayonets and muskets, human fortresses against which cavalry could do nothing. For nearly 2 hours, the elite of the French cavalry charged again and again against these islands of infantry. The horsemen would circle the squares, firing their pistols and looking for a gap, only to be brought down by disciplined volleys. The ground between the squares became choked with fallen men and horses. The charges were magnificent, an act of suicidal courage, but tactically futile. In the end, the best cavalry in Europe was destroyed in vain against the unbreakable British infantry. While Ney's cavalry was being consumed, the battle intensified for the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, in the center of Wellington's line. The garrison of the King's German Legion defended the position with incredible heroism for hours, repelling multiple French assaults. However, around 6:30 p.m., disaster struck. The defenders ran out of ammunition for their rifles. French sappers finally managed to break down the gate, and the garrison was massacred. The fall of La Haye-Sainte was the most dangerous moment of the battle for Wellington. A huge hole was opened in the center of his line. For the first time, the battle was tilting dangerously in Napoleon's favor. With La Haye Sainte in his hands, Napoleon could bring his artillery forward, which began to punish Wellington's center at point-blank range. The Allied line began to waver, casualties mounting at a terrifying rate. Entire regiments were reduced to a handful of men. It was the crisis point. Wellington rode along the line, encouraging his men, his presence a source of calm and determination. He was seen looking at his watch repeatedly, praying for the arrival of his Prussian allies. "Give me night, or give me Blücher," he is said to have muttered. The fate of Europe hung in the balance. Finally, seeing Wellington's center on the verge of collapse, Napoleon decided to play his last card, his trump card, the Imperial Guard. They were the elite of the elite, decorated veterans who had never been defeated in battle. Their advance was considered unstoppable. Around 7:30 p.m., the Guard advanced in a majestic and terrifying column to deliver the finishing blow. The French army watched, awaiting the moment that would signal victory. Wellington himself braced for the final impact, moving his last reserves to meet the threat. The Imperial Guard ascended the slope, past the bodies of Ney's cavalry under intense artillery fire. They seemed invincible, but Wellington had one last surprise. Hidden in the tall grass on the reverse slope, General Maitland's British foot guards were lying down. As the Imperial Guard reached the crest of the ridge, Wellington shouted his famous order, "Now, Maitland, now's your time." The 1,500 British guardsmen rose as one man and delivered a devastating volley at less than 20 yards. The head of the Imperial Guard's column disintegrated. For the first time in their history, the invincible Imperial Guard faltered. They stopped, tried to deploy, but were attacked on the flank by another British regiment. Confusion seized them, and then, for the first time, they began to fall back. The shock ran through the entire battlefield. A cry spread like wildfire through the French ranks, a cry of disbelief and panic. "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats. The sight of their elite unit, their symbol of invincibility, fleeing, broke the morale of the entire French army. It was at that precise moment that Wellington, seeing that the final attack had failed, stood up in the stirrups of his horse, Copenhagen, and waved his hat in the air. It was the signal for a general advance. All along the line, the battered Anglo-Allied infantry rose and charged down the hill. At the same time, Blücher's Prussian army, which had been gradually arriving and pressing Napoleon's right flank, finally crashed into the French rear. Caught between Wellington's advance and Blücher's attack, the French army disintegrated completely. The retreat turned into a chaotic rout. Entire regiments threw down their arms and fled, pursued relentlessly by the Prussian cavalry, who showed no mercy. Napoleon's great victory had turned into his most catastrophic defeat. The Battle of Waterloo was over. The Napoleonic era had come to an end in a single day of unprecedented carnage, not by a brilliant offensive maneuver, but by one man's stubborn and bloody refusal to yield an inch of ground. The carnage of Waterloo was on an almost industrial scale, a foreshadowing of the horrors of future wars. By the end of the day, the battlefield of just 8 square kilometers was covered with tens of thousands of men and horses, dead or dying. The French army suffered catastrophic losses, estimated at around 44,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, prisoners, and deserters. It was an almost total annihilation. The combined forces of Wellington and Blücher, though victorious, also paid a terrible price, with around 22,000 casualties. In a single day, more than 65,000 men were put out of action, a horrifying number that shocked Europe. The fate of the defeated commander was final and irrevocable. Napoleon Bonaparte fled the battlefield and returned to Paris, but his power had evaporated. The news of the total defeat of his elite army wiped out any remaining support. He was forced to abdicate for the second and final time. He tried to flee to America, but was captured by the British. This time, the Allied powers would take no chances. He was exiled to the remote and desolate island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from Europe. There, under strict British guard, he spent the last 6 years of his life. Writing his memoirs before dying in 1821, the eagle had been caged forever. For the Duke of Wellington, victory brought not jubilation, but a profound melancholy. After the battle, his reputation as one of the greatest generals in history was cemented. He returned to Britain a conquering hero and later became prime minister. However, the human cost of his victory haunted him for the rest of his life. His immediate reaction, upon seeing the battlefield covered with his men and his enemies, was not one of celebration, but of horror. Victory had brought him glory, but also an intimate and terrible understanding of the true price of war, a burden the Iron Duke would carry in silence until his death. The most important political consequence of Waterloo was the end of more than 2 decades of almost continuous warfare that had ravaged Europe since the French Revolution. The battle marked the definitive and absolute end of the First French Empire and of the extraordinary career of Napoleon Bonaparte, the figure who had dominated European politics and battlefields for a generation. The Congress of Vienna, which had been briefly interrupted during Napoleon's return, was able to conclude its work, redrawing the map of Europe and establishing a new balance of power designed to prevent future large-scale conflicts. Napoleon's defeat ushered in a period of relative peace and stability in Europe that would last for nearly a century, until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. This period, often called the Pax Britannica, was largely made possible by British naval and economic supremacy, a status that was enormously reinforced by the victory at Waterloo. The battle consolidated Great Britain as the world's leading power and allowed it to focus on the expansion of its global empire. Waterloo not only ended a war, but also laid the foundations for the world order of the 19th century. Over time, the Battle of Waterloo became a foundational myth, and its name became synonymous with a final, decisive, and irremediable defeat. To meet one's Waterloo came to mean facing an insurmountable obstacle that leads to one's downfall. Napoleon and Wellington became the archetypes of offensive genius and defensive master, respectively. Their opposing personalities and strategies have been studied by generations of historians and military cadets as the perfect example of the clash between 2 philosophies of war. The battle is a classic case study on the importance of the choice of ground, infantry discipline, and coordination between allied armies. The image of the British squares resisting the charges of the French cavalry, the desperate defense of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, and the dramatic collapse of the Imperial Guard have been etched into the cultural consciousness of the West. Waterloo is more than a battle. It is an epic, a human drama of ambition, courage, sacrifice, and destiny. It represents the moment when the will of one genius collided with the unshakable determination of another, and how, on that June day, stubborn defense and tenacious resistance finally triumphed over offensive brilliance, changing the course of history forever. After the last French resistance faded and victory was certain, the Duke of Wellington met with his Prussian ally, Marshal Blücher, at the inn La Belle Alliance. It was a brief meeting amidst the carnage, a handshake that sealed the end of an era. But Wellington's true reaction came later that night. As he rode back to his headquarters under the moonlight, crossing the battlefield, he did not see the glory of victory. He saw the bodies of 22,000 of his own men and his allies, and those of 44,000 of his enemies, covering the hills and valleys. The sound of the dying filled the air. Overwhelmed by the scale of the slaughter, the Iron Duke broke down and wept. Later, while writing his official dispatch, he said to his doctor, with a deep sadness in his voice, a sentence that would reveal the true heart of the man behind the myth: "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." For Wellington, the greatest victory of his life, the moment that immortalized him, was not a source of pride, but a tragedy of unfathomable magnitude. His victory brought him not the joy of triumph, but the eternal weight of its cost.